Oh, Nick, Tamara, Emily, Nemo, wonderful, wonderful to have you here. Hello, everyone. Hi to those who started joining us from home. Welcome to our event, Climate and Militarism. It's an event we've been wanting to have for a long time at the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And today we're joined by Nnimmo Bassey, Emily Gilbert, Tamara Lorincz, and Nick Buxton. A superb, superb panel. I want to let people at home know that the chat will be open today for you to say hi. Please keep all your messages cordial, of course. I also want to let people know that we are also streaming to Facebook, and so you can help us amplify this important discussion by helping us to do that, and I'll put the link in the chat there. So again, today we're joined by Nnimmo Bassey, Emily Gilbert, Tamara Lorence, Nick Buxton. I'm Bianca Mageni. I'm with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and I'm speaking to you from Daraja or Montreal, which is on the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. So I just want to say that for anybody who thinks that they can tackle the climate crisis without addressing militarism, without addressing war, we really need to think again. And today's webinar is going to be discussing the existential threat and crises of both war and climate breakdown, how they're tied to each other and how they reinforce each other. Last week was pretty monumental. It was the first time that peace has been on the thematic program of the COP Climate Conference. And to mark this, the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, which CFPI is a part of, released a declaration called Peace for Climate Justice. And we're encouraging people to amplify that, to send that to the Prime Minister, Environment Minister, Foreign Minister. And this declaration states that peace for climate justice means ending wars against each other and the earth. It means canceling fossil fuel powered weapons procurement, means cutting military spending, and it means converting from a war economy to a green care economy. So today's webinar is going to unpackage some of this and what went down at COP28, as well as the global inequities of the climate crisis. The first speaker of the afternoon is Nnimmo Bassey. Nnimmo is the director of the Ecological think tank, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, or HOMEF, and he's the former chair of Friends of Earth International and executive director of Nigeria's Environmental Rights Action. He was a co-recipient of the 2010 Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. His books include To Cook a Continent, Destructive Extraction and the Climate Crisis in Africa, and Oil Politics, Echoes of Ecological War. Welcome, Nnimmo.
Thank you very much, Bianca. And I must say, this is a very timely conversation for us to have, seeing what is going on in the world today. And the fact that many things that ought not to happen are being accepted as normal, as things as though nothing is wrong. We are reflecting briefly on what I've titled Climate Wars, because that's what most of the wars we're having are connected to climate change, not necessarily the impact, but the things that actually creates the climate crisis itself is warfare. The military and militarization has been used as tools to entrench colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and of course, xenophobic nationalism. And we're seeing situations in the world today where destruction is elevated beyond building, beyond construction, beyond regeneration, beyond building resilience. And this is one thing about climate change. I just left, I happily left the COP venue last night. And I thought I'm one of the privileged few who couldn't really stay to the bitter end, because the last report that came out was really very embarrassing, I must say. I mean, I'm embarrassed on behalf of the leaders of the world that they could struggle for 28 years and yet they're not able to come to grips with what is needed to be done. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about this in the conversation today, but the funding patterns in the world, the opening of the COP, the very first thing was payment, the mechanism for loss and damage. And I think that was meant to lull everyone to sleep, to say, well, we've got it, after so many years of struggle, this has finally happened. But when it came to placing money on the table, suddenly we saw that the justice principle of common but differentiated responsibilities almost flew out of the window, because the nation that has not been historically responsible was the first to put down a chunk of money on the table. And a nation like the US, United States of America, that has pummeled the world through wars and all kinds of climate events, put down only $17.5 million. What a big insult on the world. And it's very alarming when we consider especially how much is being spent in warfare, and how much is being spent in the war against Gaza right now, and the pattern, the mode of even accessing the money. Sometimes I understand the last bit was they not even follow the rules, the usual rules. You have to find a way to go behind. So we're really troubled. But coming from the global south, I'm almost concerned about the picture painted that we could accept anything because we have nothing. And yet the global south from 1980 to date is said to have, there's been $16.3 trillion capital flow from the global south to the global north, and only $2.9 trillion from the global north to the global south. So that really shows that funding of the climate cures has been not only the funding as well as the responsibility for burying the burden has been on the victims. And it's really very challenging for us. Now, if I may move forward to, there's some things I would like to hang on to, but let me just move forward and not, so I don't get lost in the climate fog. Because I've been personally very much touched by the conflict in the Middle East, especially the conflict in Gaza. When I see a situation where electricity is cut from the whole region, and then elements of power supply for solar and other means by autonomous suppliers have been bombing solar panels in a hospital, for example. And so we find that we talk about clean energy source, but even that is attacked by war. A little that's available is being damaged. And sometimes, so many things going on wrong. And we see many signs of further wars coming up. And most of these wars are around the issue of dirty energy, perpetuation of the fossil civilization. We've seen in the past destruction of nations because of this. What happened in Libya, what happened in Iraq, what happened, you can name many places. And right now, there's a potential of conflict between Venezuela and Guyana. And that's because of oil companies who want to drill oil in the area, stoking the fires of conflict in that region. And so everywhere we look, we're seeing either the drive for fossil fuel causing conflict, or those who want to control the resources, placing themselves in positions of power, like we're seeing with many dictatorships around the world, so consolidating that position by holding on to the source of fossil fuel resources. For example, in Myanmar, the military base being more or less fed by the fossil fuel industry. And we've seen also in places like Western Sahara, where clean energy, clean in quotes, is being stored over lands that are not negotiated most often for export to Europe, to export the energy to Europe. And so regions like Africa remain areas of extraction, either under the clean energy, the dirty energy paradigm, or even under clean energy paradigm. And so we hear a new language every time. People see the Sahara as a vast, empty land that you could just install, solar powers or whatever to ship the power out. Now we're seeing efforts for green hydrogen, clean energy, presented as clean energy, gas as transition energy for new pipelines and new conflicts. It's really, really, what the way I understand this is that humans are increasingly having limited, our vision is getting more limited, and the turmoil within us is getting more amplified, and our humanity is being diminished. And because of this, we're able to accept violent manifestations around us, and people just feel that, well, this is, you can't do anything about that. But I would like to just point out where people power have made a difference and also present a way out, that we could actually call militarization of the climate or of the energy system in the world, call out those who are enforcing that, and name them and call them out for subverting the efforts of vulnerable nations, of citizens of this world from North and the South, to look for real climate solutions. In August 2023, August this year, just a few months back, the people of Ecuador, after more than 10 years of struggle, finally managed to get a referendum on the extraction of fossil fuels of oil and gas in Yasuni, ITT. And the people voted overwhelmingly, voted to leave the oil in the soil in Yasuni. Now, what I learned from that is that resilient people staying on principle for real climate action, knowing that fossil fuel extraction does not only, and utilization is not only harmful to the climate, it also destroys territories, destroys nations, destroys politics, destroys social relations, destroys everything. And they know that they have to show an example. And so I see the people of Ecuador, people of Yasuni, as prime examples of climate champions who are taking real action and showing us the way. And also reflect my people in Ogoniland. In 1993, they rose up in people's power to expel Shell from their territory. And as we speak, from 1993 to date, not a drop of oil is being extracted from that territory, despite so many attempts. It's not easy to do, but this offers me hope that people standing together can overturn a destructive energy system that is based on violence. And the violence is not only through the barrel of the gun, but through oil spills, gas flares, ecological destruction, and all kinds of harms, displacement of communities, and abuse of human rights and the rights of Mother Earth. Every oil field and every coal mine and every gas field is a very clear crime scene. And we have to, I believe it's time to see them as such and also expose all those who are driving the world to the brink of climate catastrophe.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Nnimmo. Powerful words. Great to hear from you, but very troubling words. Thank you for naming the violence of the fossil fuel economy, naming the rising inequity, subverted efforts of vulnerable nations, but also the rising turmoil and despair. But really wonderful to hear you end off with your vision for a path forward and for pointing us towards the climate champions whose lead we really do have to follow. People power is real. Thank you. And we'll be hearing from Nnimmo again during the Q&A, so please have your questions ready. The next speaker of the afternoon is Tamara Lorincz. Tamara is was on the delegation of the Climate Action Network, CANRAC, to COP, representing the Canadian Voice for Women, of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILP, in Dubai. She is a PhD candidate in global governance at the Bassey School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University, doing research on the military's impact on the climate and environment. Tamara is also on the International Advisory Council of World Beyond War and the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Welcome, Tamara.
Good evening, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Istanbul en route back to Canada from COP28. Let me share with you a few of my observations and experiences at the Climate Summit and how I see the connection between climate and militarism. So this year's Climate Summit is not over. They're still negotiating a final agreement. Climate activists are calling for a fossil fuel phase out to be in the text. As you know, the United Arab Emirates that hosting the summit is a petrostate, an autocratic monarchy. The COP president, Sultan Al Jaber, is not only the Minister of Industry, he's also the head of Abu Dhabi's national oil company. The UAE's oil and natural gas reserves are the world's 6th and 7th largest in the world and account for 50% of the UAE's GDP. So it's a major oil and gas exporting country. This was talked about a lot and generated a lot of controversy before the climate summit started. But the UAE is also a major arms dealer, and this was less discussed. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the UAE is the 18th highest for arms export and 11th highest for imports. It accounts for 4% of the global arms transfers. The UAE just spent billions of dollars for hundreds of new missiles and over 20,000 guided bombs from the US. 2 years ago, the UAE bought 80 French Rafale fighter jets for $19 billion. Yet there was very little discussion about this. The trade in fossil fuel and the trade in fossil fuel powered weapons are linked and exacerbate a death cycle of global warming and war. But this isn't addressed at the climate summits. You may have heard that this COP was the largest so far, with over 70,000 delegates, including more than 2,400 oil and gas lobbyists, the highest number ever. There were also many militarists in attendance, including the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who helped the US launch the illegal, brutal war and occupation against Iraq. Blair was sitting in the audience listening to the leaders' opening plenary. So too was another militarist, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The fact that these warmongers are welcomed at a climate summit shows you the problem. There is no mention of the fact that NATO's wars since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, in Yugoslavia in 99, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Ukraine have worsened global warming. And there's no acknowledgement that NATO's demand for interoperable carbon-intensive weapon systems like fighter jets, tanks, and warships, and its incessant demand for 2% of GDP for military spending are diverting resources away from climate mitigation and adaptation. Military missions were not the subject of the global stocktake. At COP, the parties talk about climate finance and they say that they're searching for money, but refuse to consider military spending as a source. In 2015, at the time of the Paris Agreement, the NATO countries spent $896 billion on their militaries. 8 years later, in 2013, the 31 NATO countries are now spending $1.2 trillion on their militaries. That's more than $200 billion per year, yet they failed to meet their $100 billion pledge for climate finance to help developing countries adapt, a pledge that they promised to meet back in 2009. NATO countries owe a debt to the countries that they destroyed, who now don't have the capacity to deal with the climate crisis like Libya. Climate finance is not about charity, it's about reparations and climate justice. The other militarist in attendance was the NATO think tank, the Atlantic Council. It sponsors every year the Resilience Hub Pavilion in the Blue Zone. In the Green Zone, there were aerospace and defense contractors like Thales, BMW, Siemens, IBM, and Microsoft that have big military contracts, and they were greenwashing themselves by promoting net zero to 2050. This is a dangerous distraction that delays immediate reduction of carbon emissions that we need to do to avert catastrophic climate change. COP28 started on November 30th. 54 days after Israel's brutal bombardment of Gaza. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed and wounded and over 1 million displaced. Israel has bombed UN facilities, hospitals, schools, water treatment plants, and energy systems and destroyed people's housing. How are Palestinians supposed to adapt and become resilient to the climate crisis? I really found it despicable and disingenuous to hear the US climate envoy, John Kerry, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and other Western leaders feign concern about people vulnerable to the climate crisis while completely ignoring what is going on in Gaza and refusing to call for a ceasefire. They have also failed to call for a ceasefire in Ukraine. In both cases, these so-called climate leaders have continued to send weapons to Israel and Ukraine to prolong costly carbon-intensive wars that are killing people instead of using diplomacy and peace to end them. The greenwash and hypocrisy were really hard to bear at COP28. One of the bravest moments was at the high-level dialogue on gender responsiveness to a just transition and climate action. Ayesha Siddiqui, a young Pakistani climate activist and poet, wearing a keffiyeh draped over her shoulders, opened the event by saying to the audience, "What about the war in Gaza? Why isn't your heart broken? What happened to your humanity?" She said this as Hillary Clinton, the new global climate ambassador for health and gender, who refuses to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, was sitting in the audience waiting for her turn to speak. As a Canadian, I'm really ashamed that my government has refused to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. I asked directly our Minister of Environment and negotiating team to make a statement, but they refused. It defies our so-called commitment to climate, gender, and human rights. Very few officials had the courage to stand up for Palestine and to speak out on the connection between climate and war. There were a few significant examples or notable exceptions. During the opening summit, the King of Jordan spoke out, the President of South Africa spoke out, and I thought what the President of the Republic of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, said in his speech was really important. He said, quote, we all gather here because of a terribly difficult problem that we are facing, and that is climate change. But how are we going to resolve this issue if we are not able to resolve all of the geopolitical problems that we are facing today? There are many wars throughout the world that we haven't been able to stop. If we are not capable to deliver results on those, then how can we be certain that we will be able to deliver the very best results on climate change? You know, this is the question that really we have to contend with. How can we stop catastrophic global warming if we can't stop war? According to the IPCC's latest assessment report, we are on track to 3 to 5 degrees of mean temperature rise by 2100 in the next 70 years. During the panel event in the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance Pavilion, this is the BOGA initiative, I asked the panelists how Canada and Denmark, who are part of this panel and part of this initiative, could really go beyond oil and gas when they both have just purchased new fleets of F-35 fighter jets. Ariel Daraja, a leader with the Indigenous Climate Network, who has been resisting the tar sands in Alberta for many years, and who was on this panel, said in reply to me, "You're right. Why aren't we talking about climate, war, and militarism here at COP? Why are we silent? We have to start talking about demilitarization." Finally, I will end on little glimmers of hope. For the first time, peace was on the thematic program of COP. This was day 3, and it was combined with the health, relief, and recovery themes. The COP presidency also had a high-level meeting to announce its new declaration on relief, recovery, and peace for conflict-afflicted countries. 90 countries and 40 organizations have signed on to this declaration. However, it's really important to stress that this is non-binding, voluntary declaration, and it falls outside of the official agenda. It's on the thematic program. At the high-level meeting, the Colombian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alvaro Leiva, said, "For climate, we need peace with nature and we need global peace." Leiva was one of the Colombian peace negotiators to end the civil conflict with the armed groups in his country. So he understands the connection between peace for climate justice. We need to strengthen the ties between the climate movement and the peace movement. The call to end fossil fuels must also be a call to end war. The call for a just transition for oil and gas workers must also be a call for conversion of the military-industrial complex to a green peace and care economy. And this is what the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network released in our People's Declaration on Peace for Climate Justice. And this is what Bianca was talking about in her introductory remarks. I encourage you to read it and sign on to our open letter. This is our only hope, and we're running out of time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tamara, for your clarity and passion as always, and for cutting through the spin. Witnessing Canada's refusal to call for a ceasefire in Gaza along our failure to meaningfully address climate breakdown is truly disheartening. And as you point out, the expenditures on the war machine are staggering for anyone that follows this, just staggering. And as you point out, the money to finance transition away from fossil fuels exists. It's a matter of priorities. We don't lack the money, we lack the political will. And it's terrible to say, but our leaders are failing us. To say that is a massive understatement. So next up, thank you, Tamara. Next up, we have, oh, and please do sign the declaration for peace that Tamara has put there. Send it out if you're in Canada. Please do amplify this call and help us to continue making these connections. Our next speaker is Nick Buxton. Nick is the Knowledge Hub Coordinator at the Transnational Institute, TNA, and co-editor of the influential book, The Secure and Dispossessed, How the Military and Corporations Are Seeking to Shape a Climate-Changed World. Nick is a communications specialist with 25 years of experience working in the nonprofit international development and environmental sustainability sector. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much, Bianca, and it's great to follow on from, and to be on this panel with some people I really admire and have followed for a long time and got to know. I think it is very symbolic. I think Tamara really summed it up, and Nnimmo, that we're having this conversation now, because I think two events really crystallize the systemic nature of the crisis we're in. The fact that I woke up this morning and found out that after 28 COPs, the final declaration looks like it says that we could do a fossil fuel phase out is just beyond absurd, that we've got to language where we could address climate change after 28 years of warnings that have become more and more stark and more as we see the actual impacts of climate change unfolding in front of our eyes and affecting those who are most vulnerable the most. And at the same time, we're seeing this brutal expression of militarism in Gaza, which is a kind of level of devastation that's not been seen. You know, there's more people have died in just the space of 2 months than in 2 years in the war with Russia and Ukraine. The level of child and women deaths is just at a level that's not been seen before. And to me, it's symbolic because Israel is the 5th largest per capita spender on the military. It spends $24 billion on the military, and it's decided to address a crisis of injustice with violence and militarism. And in a broader sense, that's what I think is happening at an international level, that we're choosing to deal with the consequences of climate change. We're investing in war and dealing with the consequences rather than underlying injustices that drive many of the conflicts. So I wanted this presentation just to, I'm going to share slides because I want to share a bit about some recent research we've done, which is really pinpointing the role of NATO and why I think it's important that we, militarism and violence is going everywhere, but why we need to particularly look at the role of NATO right now. And why I think shrinking the military, it's not just a question of, as Tamara said, there's a lot of greenwashing of the military, but why actually the only solution is shrinking the military, and in particular NATO in particular, to achieve climate justice. And I want to make 3 points here, really. One is that the military is a significant contributor to climate change. The second is it's diverting resources from climate action. And the third, it's creating a framework of militarized adaptation. And all of those things are the opposite of what is climate justice. But just to kind of give you a sense of the scale, why NATO? Well, NATO is a 31-member alliance. Canada is, of course, a member. And this is looking at their spending in 21 and 22, so it's 2 years spending. But NATO makes up about 55% of global military spending. So just 31 nations, particularly, of course, the US, spend a vast amounts on the military. And they always say that it's to defend our security, that we've got threats such as China and Russia. But you can see just from the scale here that the threats, even if you kind of accept that analysis, is on an entirely different level. NATO is spending a huge amount. And this has an impact, as Tamara's been sharing, on the climate change. And what's worse is that they're not looking to shrink this, they're actually looking to grow this. And this is why I want to say why this is a particularly serious threat. So if we were to look at where they're at right now, we were measured, it's very hard to get a clear picture of emissions. So there's been some very clever calculations of trying to base estimates because in fact, right at the beginning of the climate negotiations, the US sought to exempt all the military from being accounted for in terms of emissions, and certainly not to make any binding commitments around reducing emissions. And this has meant that the emissions have been largely out of the shadows. They're starting to, thanks to lots of campaigns, being brought into the light. But you can see that they have a very significant low, if you would, footprint, what you call or carbon bootprint, as some would say. If you ranked it compared to the countries' total emissions, they would rank 40th in the world, just NATO's military. And what's happened is that the NATO is not seeking to end there, it's seeking to use this as a benchmark. And this really dates back to particularly the summit in 2000, it dates back to 2006, but in 2014, it was very strongly affirmed by NATO that all its members would seek to spend 2% of their GDP on the military, and that 20% of this military spending would go on equipment. And the US has also been pushing for this to just be the starting point, and NATO Secretary General, that this would we need to start with 2% and then go bigger. And they're also encouraging non-NATO members to make this the benchmark. So you'll soon see this 2% becoming a benchmark for what security looks like. So apart from, so that's why it's a real concern, and why it particularly matters now is that this is a goal that's been ratcheted up right now, is that we have a very small window, as Nnimmo is sharing, for action, that it's shrinking all the time. The IPCC says that we need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. That's just in 6 years' time. So any increase in emissions that adds to the problem is going in exactly the opposite direction of where we need to be going. So there's partly the issue of emissions, that we're starting to increase emissions just at the time when we need to be reducing them. And secondly, it's around and this has also been touched on, the vast amount of money that's going into this. We looked at what this would cost us in terms of additional spending between now and 2028. And it would lead to an additional $2.57 trillion of spending if we achieve that target. It would mean that the total expenditure between now and 2028 would be $11.8 trillion. And so it's really disturbing when you're at these COP summits and there's all these debates about where they can't even meet a commitment made in 2009 to deliver $100 billion a year in climate finance. And when we know there's a whole issue of the climate debt that the richest countries owe, that we are making these constant decisions to prioritize the military rather than the collective security of the planet. Just to give an idea of what that 11.8 trillion could pay for. These are some estimates from different countries. So it would pay for 118 years of the Paris climate goals. It would deliver, according to some calculations, all of the African continent's costs for climate adaptation and mitigation for 42 years. And so there's a huge misdirection of resources at a time when we critically need the money to go towards addressing climate change. And just another, this is just coming out of the COP. There was one of the few achievements of this COP was an agreement to set up a loss and damage fund. Now, this is the idea that countries are already suffering huge losses and damages when climate catastrophes hit. You know, when Pakistan had almost a third of its country underwater, you're wiping out infrastructure, you're wiping out agriculture, you're having huge impacts on housing. That's a huge loss and damage cost. And so there's been a long, long fight to even get the agreement that there would be a fund. It was agreed at this summit. And what was put on the table in terms of money the first day was $427 million. I asked our graphic designer to kind of demonstrate that between the comparison with the 1.26 trillion spent in 2023 by NATO. And he said he couldn't get a dot. If you look at that red dot in the far corner, he couldn't get it small enough for you actually to be able to see it. So that's been magnified 10 times to even be visible. So there's this kind of complete misdirection of resources, and then there's going to be the growth of military emissions that's going to come as we also do it. And I've already touched on this, but global military emissions, the top one is looking at what stock markets forecast global military emissions would increase by, and the bottom is NATO military emissions would increase from 226 to 295. That's when we add that all up between now and then, it's about 467 million metric tons. Just to give a sense of the scale of that, in total, NATO over this period would be emitting as much as the fourth largest country in the world, Russia. So there's the military emission side of it. There's also the military spending side of it. And the last thing is about what I think it gets a bit less attention is the way that it fuels conflict, because behind all of this is an arms industry. And they are using this moment of increased expenditure to get more export licenses. And what was really disturbing to see was when we actually did the calculations is to find out that NATO members export to 39 of the 40 most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So what we're seeing is we're providing weapons to some of the most climate vulnerable countries rather than finance. A significant number of these have authoritarian regimes or are already in situations of conflict. They nearly all have low human development indicators. So you're creating further instability and conflict and doing exactly the opposite of what is needed right now. And this fits into a broader picture where we are seeing weapons and militarization being given as a solution to a climate crisis. And I don't have much time to go in this, but it was really explored in a book that we pulled together on the secure and the dispossessed, where we looked at military plans for climate change, including NATO, which has its own climate change and security agreements. And Tamara has done some presentations on these that I also recommend you looking up on, done by the IPB, the International Peace Bureau, that really looks at NATO's climate agreements. And they all frame climate change as a security issue. And basically their message is that because of the crisis that we have created, although they don't use that language, we will have threat multipliers that we need more military spending and more military infrastructure to respond to. So they're basically setting themselves up for the new war, a war of climate wars that they need to be the ones to respond to. And one of the ways that we see that particularly coming through already in terms of politics and policies is around turning the victims of climate change into threats, and particularly displaced peoples. You'll see in every climate change and security plan by the military, there is something about displacement, migration, and human mobility that they say become threat multipliers. And their answer isn't to tackle climate crisis and to stop being displaced, but to prepare the military to respond to these crises. And as a result, what we've seen is a huge increase in budgets for the military and arms industry. And what's particularly important to note is that many of the arms companies who are both just benefiting from increased military spending, but also increased border spending, are the same. So the Thales, Leonardo, Lockheed Martin. They're all both winning huge military contracts that are causing some of these crises, and then they're winning the contracts to militarize the borders. So they're winning on both sides of the scale. And you can see this in the way that military stocks are booming here. If you look at the bottom thing, that's where stocks are going in terms of global stocks is the blue line. And then you look at the green line, which is particularly the military and security sector. It's above, it's consistently doing better than stocks in general. And that's why I think as part of our challenges, not just challenging our countries and their military plans, but also the industry that is really driving this response. So just to conclude, I think NATO's existence is a threat to our planet for 4 reasons. 1, because it contributes to the crisis with increased emission. Secondly, because it diverts resources needed for climate action and a just transition and to pay our climate debts. Third, because it expands the arms trade and increases the vulnerability of those most impacted by climate change. And fourth, because it's setting the frame globally for militarizing our response to the crisis, rather than building the collective and collaborative forms of common security that we so urgently need at this time.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for that wonderfully clear presentation and for the high-level summary as well of COP, especially for those of us who weren't able to attend. So while it's wonderful to hear your words, it's also horrifying to hear you talk about some of these things from turning, I mean, when you said turning climate victims into threats, my heart just plummeted. And it's also truly alarming to hear the statistics and goals and projections around NATO. And thank you for naming them as well as a threat to our climate goals, but also to global security. And I think it should be of great concern to all of us that we, despite being in this critical moment, we're heading very fast in the wrong direction. So thanks again, Nick, and look forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. Our final speaker of the afternoon is Emily Gilbert. Professor Emily Gilbert teaches at the University of Toronto and is co-author of The Militarization of Climate Change. Her current research involves issues related to citizenship, border security, the economy, nation states, and globalization. Welcome, Emily.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So delighted to be part of this panel, as depressing as it is hearing all of these facts and figures, but the energy around calling for reduction in climate change and emissions and for ceasefire in the current war against Gaza and Palestinians, but also in other wars that are ongoing. That is energizing to have those calls. And a lot of what I was going to say has already been said, but I'll try and run through it fairly quickly so we have time for questions and conversations as well. So I came to these issues just over a decade ago when I was looking at the ways that militaries were taking up this issue of climate change, which was already happening back then, but in a much more limited way than currently. So what I've been trying to track, I was very focused on this for a while and I lost attention, but it's really come back to the fore of things I've been thinking about more recently. So I'll just be speaking a little bit about some of the things that militaries are up to. So as we've already heard, militaries are amongst the largest contributors to greenhouse gases in the world. So the Conflict and Environment Observatory puts the figure at about 5.5% of global emissions are produced by militaries, which means that if they were a state in and of themselves, they would count as the 4th largest emitter worldwide. And the US military alone emits so much greenhouse gases that it would be the 47th largest emitter, as if it were its own state, just the military, far less the rest of US institutions. But notably, as has already been mentioned, these are only estimates because we really don't have a way to compel militaries to report their emissions figures. When the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to in 1997, the US wielded its influence to ensure that military emissions were not included, and they were not alone in wanting them not to be included. There has been some pressure to reverse this, and I know it's come up at some of the COP meetings, but still this reporting is only voluntary. But militaries themselves are starting to take note of this, and this is what I was trying to start teasing out when I was looking at this over a decade ago, is how militaries are actually thinking the ways that their missions are going to change. We heard a little bit about this from Nick about how their operations are going to change with the ways that they posit migration as a potential security threat, but also as they're increasingly seeing the impact that climate change is having on their own operations. So their own military naval bases, for example, are enduring hurricanes and flooding. And I want to mention that because a lot of this is out of self-interest as well, that militaries are taking up these issues. It's not because there's some benign, benevolent organization, but because they actually are encountering these challenges themselves as their naval bases are getting flooded and so on. So they're trying to do this in various ways to address these greenhouse gas emissions. They're turning to biofuels. They have different kinds of ways of thinking about fueling aircraft, for example, like the Green Hornet, which is a GE F414 that would be run on forms of biofuel. They have biomass pellet silos that they're bringing to their bases, their home operations. They're innovating in the field with solar power, so solar powered tents, as well as solar power on some of their facilities, particularly in the US. And often military bases are huge, sprawling facilities. They take up so much land, most of which they've taken away from other people, including indigenous peoples, but they're using that land to lay out a lot of solar power. So they are innovating to a certain degree along those lines. And in the sense that they are huge contributors to greenhouse gases, I mean, these are fine to be reducing their goals, as I'll point to in a few minutes. I think that's also really problematic what the militaries are doing, but they are making some of these innovations happen. And in fact, many militaries around the world have actually issued their own kinds of doctrines around climate change, climate action, climate strategies. So the United States, for example, had the US Navy climate action that they issued that's going to their vision for 2030 that came out in May 2022. The US Army has its own climate strategy, came out in October 2022. There's a Department of Defense climate adaptation plan that came out in November 2023. And none of this is to say that I'm on board with any of these kinds of projects that they have, but just to show how much they really are generating these kinds of documents and thinking around how they're going to deal with climate action. The UK has issued its own strategy on sustainability, so has the European Union as well. And even countries outside of the global north are also taking climate change on board. So Dinashri Jayaram has written about India and how it's taking on climate change issues through its military. And all of us, I think, who are looking at these kinds of issues are really signaling the challenges and the problems with these approaches, but also recognizing how this has become like really the greening of the military as they're unfolding. We've heard from Nick the way that NATO is taking up some of these issues. And I just want to speak a little bit about Canada as well, since some of us are located here in Canada. We also have our own defense, energy, and environment strategy from 2017 that was renewed in 2020. We have in our own defense policy a recognition of climate change operations and also responses. And even now, I just learned that the RMC, the Royal Military College, there's a new bachelor's degree program in geopolitics and climate science that is being proposed and developed. And I mentioned that just to show how entrenched some of these ideas are really becoming as part of the way that militaries are rethinking themselves. But some of the challenges emerge when we look at NATO's new Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence that they have announced, which will be based in Montreal. So again, for those of us in Canada, I think we really need to be paying attention to this new center that's supposed to be underway by the end of the year, although I haven't seen anything to announce that it's actually opened. But this is to be led by Global Affairs Canada and the National Defence in Canada. So this kind of twinning of political issues and national defense. And their objective, as they say themselves, so this is a quote, that the Center of Excellence will be a platform for both military and civilians to develop, enhance, and share knowledge on climate change security impacts. It will also allow them to work together to build required capabilities, develop best practices, and contribute to NATO's goal of reducing the climate impact of military activities. And I mentioned this and use this quote to really speak to the ways that the military is really inserting itself into these climate narratives around thinking about how we're going to deal with climate change and how they're enrolling civilians into their project as well. So working with universities, but also NGOs, and really kind of making this a national defense project. And I'm really concerned with the way that the militaries are taking up this space. So giving you the long list of the way that the US and the UK and NATO are engaging in these issues, and Canada as well, is really to be a sign, like a warning bell, of the ways that the military is really taking it upon themselves to address these issues, and the ways that they're changing up our ability to actually deal with the changes that have to be underway. So the fact that the military thinks it can green itself is just absolute nonsense. That they are, as Tamara said, just a distraction about the bigger picture, that they're not dealing with the causes, as Nick said himself as well, that they're only dealing and tinkering with the kind of side issues around, you know, a little bit of solar here, a little bit of biofuel there. I mean, one of the things that the US military was so proud of a few years ago was shifting from lead to copper billets, because it was said that the copper billets had less kind of environmental impact when they were there in the ground, but not at all reflecting on the way that those copper billets would be used or how they would be used to actually kill people. And so that, to me, really is such an evocative example of the problems with how the military is taking this up. It's really, they're still out there to kill, but maybe killing in a little bit more humane and environmentally or greenwashed kinds of ways. I mean, the military taking up this space is also problematic because they're absolutely anti-democratic. They rely on hierarchical frameworks of command and control. So they're not about dealing with climate change. That is about communication, negotiation, cooperation, about dealing with people at the ground level for kind of talking about what the needs are of the communities on the ground. And they're fundamentally defensive and offensive. So they're not about cooperation with other organizations or people. They're about protecting one's own. So whether it's the military's approach to migration and stopping migration, as Nick was saying, or the other kinds of ways that they're thinking about initiatives, they are really reframing the ways that we are able to engage in these kinds of debates. And as we've also heard too, part of this objective around defense and offense is particularly coming from the global north, is pitching those people who are most at risk as the problem, as the ones who are the risk. And this is really important when we think about the relationship between the global north and the global south and how this is panning out. So we've seen in different kinds of people evoking concepts like climate colonialism, atmospheric appropriation, or CO2 colonialism, like colonialism with the O2 in there, which I think is a really clever kind of reframing of this. But the militaries have always been at the forefront of these kinds of colonial imperial practices. And we need to really ensure that they don't take that and retool that in terms of our thinking about climate change. Some other issues we've also heard through Nick's presentation about how the military, with all the resources that are being thrown at it, is deepening the military industrial academic complex. So the kinds of investments that they are able to make in terms of development of new technologies and innovations. So solar power, for example, maybe that's something that will have knock-on implications for civilians, for example, a wider distribution of its use. But there's also lots of ways that, you know, the militaries are never going to be thinking about how to do public transport better, for example. They will be focused on SUV style vehicles and maybe making them hybrid, but they're not going to be rethinking the ways that we can design our societies for better ways of being. And so this is another challenge that I see. And in fact, the military in the US in particular, often when it comes to other kinds of environmental objectives, are the first to put their foot down and object to them if they feel that they are infringing on their own space. So militaries are by no means benevolent in these terms. It's really as long as they're the ones who are at the front of the innovation that they are on board with this project. And in fact, we see the ways that different companies are using the ways that militaries are retooling themselves to promote themselves as green companies. And Nico Edwards has written about this in quite a few great pieces. I think Nico might be online here. If you are, please post some of these examples of your writing for others in the chat. But the ways that companies who are involved in arms production or other kinds of innovation are using the military's greening as opportunities to green themselves or to present themselves as being more green. And then just a few final words here. We see the ways that, over time, militaries have really inserted themselves into thinking about themselves as humanitarian, so more humanitarian. They're better at killing these days than they used to be. That's one of their big claims. And they're really using climate change as a way to present themselves as being more benevolent or more sustainable. And I think we really have to push back this idea that our future of peace, justice is really reliant on militaries, because that's what they are insisting, that we need more militaries for more peace. And I want to absolutely resist that kind of perspective. And as we've already heard, and I'll just reiterate, you know, the ongoing war against Gaza, against Palestinians is absolutely abhorrent. And the ways that militaries are using it as an opportunity to bring more arms to in fact, buttress themselves is really part of the problem that we face. We see rising military spending, as we've already heard, and at the same time, we see increasing climate change. So there is a direct correlation between those. And then just to conclude, I mean, one thing about having done this work over a decade ago and coming back to it, one thing that absolutely has changed, which is really exciting, is so many more people are talking about these links now than they were previously, including this panel today, but all kinds of people at the COP meetings and beyond, maybe in the informal COP meetings and beyond. And that is really exciting to see the kinds of alliances that are forming, the kinds of activism that are possible, and in fact, absolutely needed in this moment as we address these issues. So I'll just end with that on a note of some optimism, saying that there's lots of room here for thinking creatively and differently about how we address climate change. And I really think that one of the ways that we do so is to refuse military and militarisms, and particularly their way that they're claiming the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you also for all of these updates. I think this is a lot of information that a lot of us are not aware of. And I take very seriously the warnings that you're giving us around how the military is engaging with these issues. There's a lot that we need to watch out for, and it's very clear that we can't allow the military to lead conversations about climate action. And also just really compelling how you present the absurdity of the military as green, or as trying to be green in any way. And I think this greenwashing needs to be seen as an offense in and of itself, and a way of avoiding meaningful climate action. So we are now at the end of our presentations. Thank you so much. That was incredibly illuminating. I have learned a lot, very, very inspired by your clarity and your passion and your vision as speakers. We do have some questions from people in the audience, and also a few questions that were posed in advance. We have a little bit of time to take those. So the first question that I have here is around the COP. Were there any agreements that came out of COP regarding the issue of peace? And if so, what were they? So is there anyone that could elaborate on some of those outcomes? Tamara?
Yeah, so the COP president did announce a declaration on relief, recovery, and peace for conflict afflicted countries. And this is a very weak declaration. It's so weak that countries that are the biggest arms dealers and countries that are launching all of these wars, like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the other NATO countries, have signed on to this declaration. But it is significant that the theme of peace was even mentioned on the thematic program of a climate summit. And for us climate activists, that was a really important lever for us to give our vision of peace for climate, for climate justice. This is one of the reasons why Canadian climate activists and peace groups, came out with our People's Declaration on Peace for Climate Justice. But at COP28, many of the climate activists, for instance, the women of WILP, who have started a demilitarization for Climate Justice Working Group in the Women Gender constituency, used that day, December 3rd, the Peace Day, as a way to make the links between the climate crisis and war, and call for demilitarization, and that kind of thing. So I also want to mention that it was at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, that the Egyptian presidency announced an initiative called Climate Responses for a Sustainable Peace, and that was the foundation that was used over this past year by the UAE presidency to do something more on peace. So there is a recognition that peace needs to be part of the climate conversation. With the war in Ukraine and this war in Gaza, leaders are recognizing that that something needs to be done around peace. Peace needs to come into the conversation. It's just they don't want to go as far as they need to go. They don't want to call for an end to war, just like they don't want to call for an end to fossil fuels. That's the direction that we really need to go. We need to call for the abolition of NATO. We need to call for demilitarization and disarmament. Those are the kinds of really bold needed steps that we need to take if we're serious about the climate crisis.
Thank you, Tamara. Are there any other thoughts on COP and the peace outcomes? All right, I'm going to go on to the next question that we have. We have a couple of questions around military and emissions. Marinella wants to know if there are any countries that include in their NDCs the military sector in their pledges to reduce emissions, despite that being excluded since the Kyoto Protocol. And someone else would like to know whether there is any country. Oh, I think that's a little bit different. And there's someone who wants to know specifically for Canada what the proportion of federal emissions is from the military. So yeah, is there anyone who wants to discuss whether there are any countries that are actually disclosing?
I could say a little bit, but Tamara maybe can add.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick. Go ahead, Nick.
I've looked myself more closely at the military spending side of it, but just to say that there is a resource called militaryemissions.org that has been doing some tracking and monitoring of reporting. It's a complicated picture because as usual, the emissions are hidden in lots of different sectors. So there's not just there's the emissions of the infrastructure that the military has, there's the emissions of their operations. There's also a look at them, whether they're reporting emissions of, for a long time, there was fuels. Some countries report fuel use in their own country, but not of overseas. And so it's been a really patchy reporting, and no one is really given a complete picture. And so that's one of the big demands of movements, is even that there should be a special report done by the IPCC that looks at the issues of the military, and that we have these not just this kind of voluntary. What we have right now is no longer a deliberate exemption of the military, but a voluntary approach, which means that people just report what they want to report. Countries report what they want to report. And we really also need to make sure that includes the whole supply chain, because the arms industry itself uses huge amounts of emissions and in right through its whole supply chain, and so those things need to be included as well. So that's just, that's some more resources. It's in the report Climate Crossfire. We do, and also Scientists for Global Responsibility have done some good stuff of kind of drilling down what a more comprehensive look at emissions would mean, and I can post a couple of those resources in the chat.
Thank you, Nick. Tamara.
Can I add to that by saying that the Paris Agreement let countries determine how they were going to reduce emissions. There wasn't any prescription, what sectors needed to be reduced. And there was, of course, this provision for offsetting emissions, this idea of net zero. But if you look at the nationally determined contributions, which is the reports that countries, have sent to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, how they're going to reduce emissions. If you look at Canada's, the UK's, the United States, New Zealand, for instance, they don't explicitly mention the military as a sector, how they're going to reduce emissions. The Australia does mention the military emissions in their nationally determined contribution report to the UNFCCC, but they specify that is a sector that that is excluded from their emission reduction. So they're very explicit to say that the military is exempt. And if you read Canada's Department of National Defense's Defense, Energy and Environment Strategy that Emily referred to, in their 2017 report, they were also very clear in saying that military emissions are exempt from the national reduction targets. So militaries are planning, to offset their emissions. They're going to continue as business as usual with all of their carbon intensive training and operations and war fighting and carbon intensive procurement. And they're somehow going to offset these emissions by 2050, but there's no public plan, no credible plan to offset these emissions. How many trees are they going to plant to offset the new fleet of F-35s? And then I want to share something that I learned at COP28 that has really disappointed me, and I know will also disappoint Nick. For the past 10 years, I have written to the UNFCCC Secretariat, calling on them to invite the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to do a special study on military emissions and emissions from war and conflict. And at one of the IPCC plenaries at COP28, I made an intervention and I specifically asked, I called on the IPCC and the new chair, Jim Skia, he's a British national, if the IPCC would do this. I said, I have sent you repeated letters, will you do this? Because we need your guidance on this. And he said, they're not going to do it. He said that they have about 2 pages worth of special reports that they need to do. And this is just not on their radar and it's not a priority. The next special report that they're going to do is on cities and climate change. So, this is really disappointing because we don't have any, there's no constraints from any body on military emissions, and this is really going to be a problem. And this is why the global climate movement, peace movement really need to come together, because it's going to be up to us to try to to constrain this and to stop this.
Thank you, Tamara. On the question of restraint, Kimry has a question around policing, and do you think that working for abolition of the police could further the cause of abolishing the military? And I think what I would add to that is, what can we do to sort of weaken the strength of the military? Like, what are the avenues?
I was wondering, I'd love to hear from Nnimmo
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So I was about to say that question is really very, it's very fundamental. We cannot reduce the power of the military except we overturn capitalism, because a whole lot of what is going on, the economic system requires to be enforced by force. This activism that ignores communities, ignores territories and peoples, that commits ecocide regularly without batting an eyelid. can only be done through the force of the military. The military is an incredible institution that actually needs to be abolished. We need to work towards abolishing the military. I heard once that the military called a seminar on environment-friendly warfare. And, you know, it's just mind-boggling to even think about that. What would that mean? Kill people, but keep the trees, or what? Keep the frogs and keep every other being. You know, how could destruction be friendly, environment friendly? So I think that's just it. We have to work towards overthrowing the current system, which is cannibalistic and doesn't really care.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Yes, when I hear the comments of our panelists today, it becomes so clear how entrenched all of this is, how quickly we're moving in the wrong direction. And I think the only conclusion that one can draw is that there just needs to be a total transformation. You know, something really, really deep has got to be changed, because there's 28 years, you know, and getting the type of statements that we're getting out of COP. I mean, it's clear that, like, this is not working, you know, and trying to chip away at it is not working. And we're running out of time on many different fronts. So thank you for that. Thank you for naming that need to just transform society. I think we need to be saying that more and more and more. And I think that's the place of actual hope, because I think it's clear, and it's there's a path forward there versus despair. So we have a question around, is there from an anonymous attendee who wants to know whether there's any country in the world who spends more on their climate budget than their military budget? And there was a question earlier that I think perhaps Tamara or Emily could answer around what proportion of Canada's emissions specifically come from the military. Maybe I'll start with Emily.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't know that there is a that is absolutely tracked, the Canadian emissions. If you look at the website that Nnimmo mentioned, Canada is notorious for not reporting on these kinds of things. But in the 2017 defense overview, or the report that Tamara mentioned, they did say that in Canada, the military greenhouse gas emissions were more than half of the overall government emissions. So there was some recognition of that. Now, that doesn't probably count forward operating kinds of operations and other things. But even if we're to think just about domestic facilities and bases, that's a huge amount of Canada's contributions. It's over half of what the government claims it emits.
Thank you, Emily.
If I could just add that the Canadian government established in 2017 the Greening Government portal, and they are trying to track carbon emissions from all of the federal departments. So they are doing some reporting on the emissions of the Department of National Defense. But there is something called the National Safety and Security Exemption. So even though they're tracking some of the emissions, they're saying that these emissions aren't part of the national reduction target. And they're not fully transparent about what comprises military emissions. They are saying, like, if you look at the charts, that about 61% of federal government emissions are from the Department of National Defense, are from the military. So this is substantial. And the Department of National Defense also accounts for 30% of the federal budget. So, this problem of military emissions and military spending is really a huge obstacle to us in having a just transition. I mean, so much money is going to this carbon intensive militarism. And just to remind everybody, this year, while Canada was facing, it's the worst forest fires ever, so many, 7,000 across the country, our government announced that we are going to invest $19 billion a price tag for 88 new F-35 fighter jets. The Parliamentary Budget Office just a month ago said that the life cycle cost of these warplanes is going to be $74 billion. And then in the midst of these raging fires, in July, the federal government said it's going to invest $3 billion in aerial refuelers, the tankers that supply the fuel for these fighter jets in the sky, on top of $38 billion for new runways and hangars in the Arctic for these F-35. So we're militarizing the Arctic, a fragile ecosystem, investing in all of this military infrastructure instead of doing what we need to do, and that is reduce emissions and engage in a just transition. So this is just a huge problem that we have to tackle. And this is something that I constantly raised at COP28. I went to the Canadian Pavilion. I went to the other NATO countries and I said, how can you be serious about the climate crisis when you're investing in this, in new fighter jets and tanks and warships? There's just no way. And they felt very uncomfortable. And you can see the room, went silent, and people struggled to respond to this. But we have to continue to challenge them and confront our governments on these issues, because it's just totally incoherent and inconsistent with their claims about taking action on the climate crisis.
Thank you, Tamara.
And just a quick follow-up. I mean, that was great. Thank you, Tamara, for all of that information. But I mean, the real problem here with militarizing the Arctic, which we've been doing now since Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, I mean, it was ongoing before that, but he really ramped it up, is precisely because of the impact of climate change in the Arctic, which is making it more navigable. So there's more, tourists who are going up, there's more transportation with tankers. So this kind of ongoing cycle of the damage that we're inflicting by climate change is leading to more militarism, which is creating more climate change. It's just a kind of endless loop.
We have a question from Joan for Nnimmo. Joan wants to know if you could comment on whether the developed countries are fulfilling the objective of the UNFCCC, and whether it might be possible for developing countries to launch a case at the ICJ.
That's an excellent question. The short answer is that the industrialized polluting nations are not, they're not doing their fair share. They're not doing what they ought to be doing to tackle global warming. And we've heard, they've been working very carefully on a plan to work contrary to what is needed. And I think one of the times when this disruption really happened was at COP15 at Copenhagen, when the voluntary mechanism came into being. And this was consolidated in the Paris Agreement, where nations can do whatever they want to do in the nationally determined contributions. And climate action cannot be voluntary for those who are historically responsible. I believe that there could be a good case if nations will come together, say, look, and this is the argument for a recognition of a climate debt. It's a climate debt over the years. And if that is recognized and paid, it would eliminate the need for endless debates on climate finance, on even loss and damage. But sometimes people say, how do you estimate the cost of how much is the climate debt? And the simple rule of the thumb way to calculate that is, let's say the military budget. If you put a military budget as climate debt every year, that will take care of the problem. So it's not about lack of money. It's about lack of vision and lack of humanity. So yes, I do agree that a case can be made at the International Court of Justice. I'm not a lawyer, but I think I feel in my heart that that is something that can be done.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Yes, CFPI has been wanting to discuss the question of climate debt and international inequity for some time, and we find that there aren't enough people, certainly in Canada, talking about this. It's really great to hear you talking about that, and I am personally wondering whether sort of the main environmental NGOs and media are addressing this issue, if at all. Nnimmo, I'm wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I believe that the climate negotiation is wired to fail as long as we don't have binding emission reduction requirement, as used to be, as was the case before, even though it wasn't sufficient. And this is why every nation jumped up to sign. The Paris Agreement is inherently defective because of that. And I think we need a people's COP that would be counter to the official COP. And because the next COP, I don't want to be a prophet of doom, but it's bound to fail, just like the current one. It's going to another petro state. And so the COP after that will be the COP in Brazil. That, if there's any glimmer of light, that could be the moment when people could rise and now we're in charge of the COP. But that was attempted in Bolivia by the People's Summit in 2010, came out with a fantastic outcome with the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And then those who have the power, who hold the levers of power, just ignore it and keep moving. So yes, we need to work towards overturning the COP.
Thank you. We have a question from Chiara around sort of international solidarity. Chiara says, we know that the climate movement must be anti-imperialist and decolonial to be just and effective, and wants to know how people in the North can support climate justice movements in the majority world, and also mentions that historically movements in the global South have been brutally crushed. Do any of our panelists have any thoughts around this question around international solidarity and how people in places like Canada, for instance, can be supportive?
I like the silence.
I know.
Well,
pause. We need to think about this.
Nnimmo, why don't you go first? And I have a couple of things that I could say.
Okay, I will just say very quickly that already I believe there are movements that span both the global North and global South, and we just need to build that and expand that, especially the youth movement and indigenous movements. The ideas coincide, the energy, everything, and we just need to work more together. There also, I think the system is also engineered it's quite difficult for everyone to operate at the same level. And so we need solidarity is very necessary to support each other so that you have both inside and outside energies coming together to really work towards common objectives. And things like the right of Mother Earth is a very great tool that we could use, to build solidarity across the world and really push our the leaders to think differently than they're thinking now. And also we need to be more imaginative. The military controlling the narrative in so many ways. And we really need to tackle that. For example, a lot of people believe, both in the global North and global South, that we cannot do without petroleum civilization. And, some people ask, if you leave petrol all in the soil, how are you going to develop? And we don't have enough discussion about what development means and where we really want to go in the future. Where is the pathways to the future? What kind of life do you want to live? Do you want to live with the grenades protect you, or the bombs and the tanks? Or do we want to live in harmony with ourselves and with nature? So how do we have enough grounds for us to work together and build solidarity and build our humanity?
If I can just add by saying that that I attended the Climate Action Network International Strategy session before COP on November 29th, and I also attended their big strategy session on December 7th, the rest day at COP. And I'm really impressed with the fact that can international centers the leadership, of activists from the global South. And, I've really learned so much from them. Also, I attend, when I attend the COPs, I always participate in the Women Gender Constituency, which is one of the 9 constituencies under the UNFCCC. And there as well, the women put to the fore the great women leaders from the global South. And again, I've learned so much. And I see that the links between the global South and the global North in those civil society spaces that I just think are so important. And I just would encourage people to get involved with the Climate Action Network, to read the great report that centers their voices. I'll put a link to the chat for that. And then finally, I want to say, if you haven't read it already, to read the IPCC 6th Synthesis Assessment Report that says throughout the document that international cooperation is the crucial enabler for climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And I say to everyone, international cooperation can only be achieved if we, stop the fighting and start collaborating. We've got to end the wars and disarm and demilitarize for this cooperation and solidarity. So I think there are the tools, there are the policies. We just need to marshal them and get to a place where we get to a tipping point, for peace, for climate justice, for ending these wars and ending fossil fuels.
Thank you, Tamara.
Just add one quick thing, and this is just more of a speculative question, or I'm wondering, I think a lot of the ways that we talk about the actions that we can take are either from the bottom up or vis-a-vis the government and the militaries, which are often an arm of government. But I think we leave industry, the private sector out of some of these conversations. And I think those entanglements are super deep. They're global. We can act locally, but also speak globally if we take some actions against the companies and corporations that are fueling these wars, that are creating climate change. And really, I think that could be another way that we create solidarities that are beyond our local specificity, but that speak volume. So that's just another thought.
Thank you so much, Emily. And kind of the flip of this question, I mean, these conversations are increasing, but still rare. So my flip question to you, and my final question is, why aren't more climate activists peace activists? Why aren't all climate activists peace activists?
Perhaps I'll go first this time. I think one of the things is that there's been a lot of siloing of movements for a long time. So people have kind of focused on one issue and not been willing to kind of make the links and connect the dots. And I think perhaps what's happening is people are starting to connect the dots. And as you heard from the COP, there are people realizing that we cannot address the climate crisis without the military crisis. The fact that we have such a short window, and yet the whole world, the richest countries are investing in war right now in a dramatic way, rather than addressing a far more existential threat that faces the whole of humanity, just as an illustration that we have to, this is a time of connecting the dots. And I think for a long time, people were struggling, especially in climate, it's a hard enough push. So people thought, it's another issue, I can't take it on. It's hard enough taking on big oil. Can I take on the Pentagon as well at the same time? So there was a bit of that, but I just feel that there is a people connecting the dots and making those connections and realizing that we have to address both. And I really start to see the beginnings of climate and peace movements coming together. It's going to be, we also know that in a more unstable world, we need to find different ways of responding, because otherwise we will have a constant default to military solutions, which will only make a grave situation even worse. We really have to, it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge, but it's also one that we just have to grapple with. And I just wanted to kind of finally amplify what Emily was saying about, I do think corporations are a target that in some ways we should put more of a focus on, because I think they're the ones who are driving the politics and the policy and the money flows. And so if we can find in your place who are the arms companies that are shaping policy in your country, who are the ones who are shaping it, who are the ones winning most of these contracts, who are the ones profiting from this climate crisis and fueling a breakdown, then that's one great way of kind of starting to intervene in this cycle of violence.
Thank you, Nick. Any last comments before we end our discussion for the afternoon? Well, Nick, I think that was an excellent note on which to end. I think as our incredible panel has so clearly outlined, when it comes to climate change and militarism, and war, there is this vicious cycle, and to have the international cooperation that is required to address climate change, we can't be supporting war and militarism. Simultaneously, the droughts and the floods and the rising sea levels exacerbate these social and political tensions, fan the flames of conflict. And so if we're climate activists, I think we must also be peace activists. So just continuing the call to end fossil fuels, to end wars. I want to thank everybody at home. I implore you to stay informed, to stay engaged, to support all of the activists, authors, and academics, and follow their work that you've heard today. Let's bring these struggles together. Let's keep making these links, connecting the dots, supporting youth and Indigenous movements in the Global South, continuing to confront our own leadership here in the North. And also, please do support the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute if you can, if you like conversations like this, at foreignpolicy.ca/donation. I want to thank our panelists again. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Nnimmo. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Nick, for your tremendous research, scholarship, activism, courage, and clarity. So good afternoon, everyone, and peace.